this is going to be transforming IT teams with Jira Service Management. If you're not familiar with Jira Service Management, or you haven't used it extensively, or maybe you haven't used it for IT teams, this is going to be a webinar going pretty much over the primary things that are crucial for setting up a good ITSM within Jira and Jira Service Management. And then a few tips and tricks that we've kind of implemented along the way. And this is not going to be super beginner friendly. I wouldn't say that if you've never used JSM that this is maybe the best webinar for you, but it's still going to be a really good starting point for anyone who's not super familiar with JSM to anyone who is a lot more advanced with Jira Service Management and has been using it for quite a bit of time. So next slide here, my name is Josh. I'm the CEO of Grid.io, and we primarily pretty much just work with Atlassian and Atlassian products and applications and their entire suite of apps. That's all we do. That's our number one focus, and we've worked with hundreds of IT teams at this point to create and to implement solutions like ITSM, like HRSM. We've also worked with some development teams and other teams within the Jira and Atlassian space over the past few years. So here's how we've kind of perfected our Atlassian implementation. So as I mentioned, we've worked with a lot of teams at this point, hundreds or even thousands of teams across a lot of different industries. A lot of them have their own unique requirements, and we've identified a lot of those things that are requested from a lot of those teams to implement in their ITSM environment. And after working with so many teams, you kind of just pick and choose the best from each team. And at that point, are you guys not able to see the screen? Okay, let me try refreshing here just to make sure. Let me reshare just in case someone can't see it. Okay, cool. There we go. So we've pretty much identified all of the patterns, all the challenges, all the common things that we've come across all of these teams, and we've basically thrown it into one implementation, and we have a lot of frameworks. We have a lot of tips and tricks within this webinar that we'll share that we've been able to create and been able to implement within our ITSM environment in Jira over the past years. So this will include things like best practices and common pain points. And this will also include anything that we feel like has been a really good we've had really good reception from those teams, not just the agents, but also the customers. Because obviously when we're creating a ITSM implementation with a customer support portal, we want the customers to feel like they're able to submit a request easily, they're able to get support easily, and they're satisfied with the support that they receive. So if you want to stay connected, feel free to scan this QR code on the screen or just go to our website, grid.io, and then my LinkedIn, Josh Golsinski. Feel free to follow me there or send me a message there. I'm always open to collaboration. I'm always open to new projects, or if you want some advice, feel free to reach out. More than happy to help you guys out if anyone is in need of any kind of consultation or just has a couple of questions that they want answered. So a quick agenda. We're going to go over a couple of key definitions just to outline and make sure that everybody's on the same page when we reference some of these specific definitions that are maybe JSM or ITSM related. And then we're going to share the blueprint for IT teams. Then we're going to go over a little bit of reporting, which is a bit of a bonus since it wasn't initially included here, but we thought it'd be pretty critical for an IT team to have at least some kind of reporting right off the bat, even if you're very small or if you're a very large team. Then we'll do a quick Q&A at the end, hopefully answering any kind of questions that may have come up, whether that's JSM related, process related, really anything else. Then we'll share a couple of exclusive tools to just the people that have been able to join this webinar. We have a couple of things that we wanted to share with you guys that might be very helpful for implementing and setting up your JSM environment. So first things first, a couple of terms to know. There are a few here that I'll be mentioning throughout the webinar, so I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, and we know that when I mention a specific term like customer agent, that means customer is anyone who is submitting a request on the portal, and agent is anyone who is working within the backend of Jira. So if I say customer, I don't necessarily mean your customer. So if your company deals with customers directly, the way that Jira Service Management defines customer is just someone that is submitting a request on the portal. And then agent is someone who's on the back end, so receiving these requests and working on them, and that's going to be like a help desk agent or a level 1, L2, L3 agent. SLA, service level agreement. That's essentially a feature that Jira has that lets us define SLAs for tickets that are coming in. We can define them based on priority, which is what we'll go over as well. So that's just service level agreement. Request type, that's the way that Jira breaks down issue type and request type. I'll go over that a little more in depth as well, but we'll be going a lot over issue types, which is kind of the top level hierarchy. So we'll have incidents, we'll have service requests with we'll have service requests with approvals. Those are all issue types, and then we'll have request types under that, which are going to be your typical requests that you'll see, like requesting a new laptop, requesting a new piece of hardware, piece of software, access to software. Those are request types that live under the issue type. Workflows, we'll be going over those as well. Workflow is essentially just a group of statuses within Jira. So we might have an open to in progress to done. Those group of statuses are just a workflow. Reporter. Reporter is just the person who submitted the request. That's how Jira defines a reporter. And assignee, that is the person who is working on the request within Jira. So just wanted to make sure that we cleared all those definitions up, since I'll be referencing them quite a bit throughout the rest of the presentation. So here's a quick overview before I jump into the actual demo and start looking within JSM and going over these items. But we'll essentially be looking at issue types and request types. So this will be a lot of form, conditional logic, portal, and portal groups. We'll be really going over that and putting on our customer hat and going over exactly how we should structure and implement a customer portal. Then we'll be going over workflows, and this will be a little bit more agent and backend focused. So we'll be going over some more basic workflows, as well as some approvals, escalations, and customer triggered actions. And then we'll go into queues, and then we'll go over some tiered queues, the way we set up those queues, and how we approach having different queues for different teams or different request types. SLAs, we'll go over priority-based SLA configurations, potentially some alerting and some automations around those SLAs. And then we'll touch on reporting as well. Some of those reports may be linked to some SLAs or just assignees or team performance, or really anything related to the ITSM environment. All right, so we'll jump into questions at the end, but I'll go ahead and dive into the demo and overview first, and I'll start going over the portal and request types. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here for the portal first. Okay, there we go. So I'll go ahead and start here, and I'll go over this portal here first, because I want to be able to essentially set how the customer will be viewing this portal and how they'll be interacting with it. So this is obviously going to be the service desk portal specifically for IT requests. But if we go to the very home page of the portal, we'll obviously have, in some cases, human resources, facilities. In some cases, there are other portals as well. We'll be looking specifically at the IT service desk portal, but it is important to keep in mind that there is a home page here that some customers may just jump into and just type in something to search, like laptop, and they might find some help articles as well as some request types here. But when we're building out a portal specifically for customers inside of our IT team, this is what it's going to look like on the actual IT team homepage, quote unquote. Since this isn't the entire homepage of the entire portal, this is specifically kind of the home for the IT space. So the first thing that we start here is the grouped request types. So as I mentioned, there are request types, and those request types look something like this. So there might be report a broken asset. That's one request type. Request a new laptop is another. So the challenge here, and the first thing that we kind of run into, is how do we structure these groups in a way that makes the most sense for our end users and our customers. And what we really want to do is take off our Jira administrative hats and our IT hats and really put on the customer hat and understand what is going to be the easiest and best way for a customer to approach this and be able to submit a request in the most easy and simple way possible. So the way I've structured it here, and this is typically how I'd recommend it, and this isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all, but it is a really good starting point and a really good approach to get this thing kicked off and set up in the right way if you don't have a current service portal, or if you're reevaluating and re-implementing something within your company, and this is kind of something that you're wanting to restructure. So what I've done here is made it super simple for pretty much anyone who's not tech savvy. Think of your grandma, not super tech savvy and doesn't know how to use an iPad or something like that. Someone who's not very technically inclined, if they jump onto this portal, what are they going to see, and are they going to be confused? So if I'm someone who's not very tech savvy, I see here general IT request, and this is kind of going to be your catch-all, you can say. And I used to be a little bit more against catch-alls because we want a little bit more definition and specific fields to be set up. But the more you put on the customer hat, and the more you want the process for submitting requests to be as frictionless as possible, the more I come to the conclusion that a catch-all is kind of necessary, especially if someone just needs to jump in and submit a request as quickly as possible. This is pretty much the easiest way to do it. So you have that one catch-all request type. What issue are you dealing with? My device, system or access, some conditional logic, which I'll get into in a second. But the idea here is that we have a really easy place to maybe, let's say, they feel like they don't have a laptop or equipment issue. They feel like they don't have a login or account issue. And maybe it's not an employee transition request, but they don't really know where it goes. And, instead of being stuck here for 10 minutes trying to figure out which request type it is, which fields they should be filling out, they have a really easy place to jump in and say, okay, I'm just going to submit a general IT help request and get my problem out there. That way it could be dealt with as soon as possible. So like I said, I'm kind of leaning towards having this catch-all more so than I used to in the past, but definitely something that could be adjusted from team to team. If your employees are relatively tech savvy, I've seen teams not use catch-alls and they've been totally fine, and their employees don't complain, don't have any issues with these service desks. But I've seen some teams that have struggled with it a little bit. So I do suggest implementing this maybe just to start out, see what kind of requests you are getting submitted, and maybe if there's a lot of common occurrences or if there's a lot of similar requests that are coming in, we could remove this catch-all and then implement very specific requests with a little bit more details to be submitted when those requests are submitted. So again, varies from team to team, but something to try out if you haven't done it in the past. So going from that general IT request, which is again kind of the catch-all if we don't have anything inside of these other options that we have here. The other couple of things that an end user would typically run into is a laptop or equipment issue. So think of this as hardware. And if you type in hardware here, the problem is it might be a little bit difficult for an end user to understand that I have a hardware problem. What does that mean exactly? If it's a hardware problem, is it like my laptop? Is it something else? But if you specifically say laptop and equipment, they know that it's your laptop, your keyboard, your monitor. It's a little bit more user-friendly. So the idea here is just let's make things as easy and simple as possible to submit for the end user. So here we have laptop and equipment. If it's not a laptop or equipment issue, it's going to be a login or account issue. So typically this is some kind of access problem, requesting a new piece of software access, maybe Wi-Fi access or something software or login or account related. And again, this is kind of think of your hardware requests and your software requests just renamed in a more approachable way. The reason I also don't like to use hardware and software, which I know is common for a lot of teams, but let's say I am on my laptop and I have an issue that shows up, and maybe I can't restart my laptop, or I can't update my laptop. Is that a hardware request or is that a software request? So if it is a piece of software that's having the issue that's on my laptop, it's kind of hard to decipher which one it is. But in this case, it's a lot easier since we have a laptop request and equipment request, so we know where to go. And if it's account or login specific, then we know it's a different request type. So this will be more so if you can't log in or if you need access to an account rather than a problem with a specific account or a piece of software. And the last one here is employee transitions. This may or may not live on your IT portal. This is also very team to team based, but I thought I'd throw it in here in case that your IT team does do a lot of employee transitions and onboarding and offboarding. Those are pretty common to have here, but I do have a way of triggering this from an HR portal, which is definitely a better option, and I'll go over that in a little bit as well. But in case your service desk team wants to receive those here on the portal, let's say your HR team is submitting those here, this is a great place for all those items to live. So hopefully that makes sense. And a couple of things here that are definitely good to keep in mind. Number one, let's make sure that we don't overload this list and have like 10 groups here. The more groups you have, the more complex it gets. I like to keep it around 6 at the most, 4 to 6, maybe 3 to 6 is a good range to be in, where you're not having, a list of 20 request types inside of one group. And at the same time, you're not having a ton of groups here or too little groups. So keeping roughly 3 to 6 is a good amount. That kind of depends on the amount of request types you have as well. But definitely don't overload this screen and don't make it too complicated to jump in here and understand what needs to be submitted. That goes for essentially the same thing with these request types. You don't want to have 20 request types within one group, because then I'm scrolling through trying to find which one makes most sense, which one is most logical to submit in this case. It's really hard to decipher, and I have a way of negating this and requiring more information once we jump into the request type, and I'll show you what that looks like. But we definitely don't want to overload any of these screens. We want them to be very boilerplate and very, very high level and easy to understand what should be submitted. So again, putting on our customer hat, let's say that I am having a problem with, or let's say I need to access an account. Let's say I need access to DocuSign. I'm someone that just joined and I don't have access to DocuSign currently. I jump into this portal and I look at these groups and I say, okay, great, logins and accounts. Super easy, super simple. Now I'm on this page here, and let's say I need to request a new account since I don't have access to DocuSign yet. So the only one that makes sense to me here is requesting system or access to software. So jumping into this request type, you'll see that it's pretty basic at first. And this, again, we're using a lot of conditional logic here, so it's going to get a lot more complex and a lot more fields are going to show up here shortly. But this is kind of a trick that I've implemented in a lot of IT teams that we've worked with in the past. Specifically to make the forms easier to fill out. So I'm sure you're all familiar with like those marketing forms on different websites, to where you start with one field, you type in your name, you type in your email, and then the more you go, the more they expand and the more the fields start to pop up over a little bit of time. And the reason they do that is to make the form feel simpler and easier to submit. So essentially what we've done here is implemented the same thing for a customer who's submitting an IT request. So if I'm saying I need access to Adobe, or DocuSign, or whatever the application is. Number one, we're going to have some suggested articles here, which are great for self-help if you're having an incident issue, which is more of a problem with the software, not necessarily access, but still might be good to reference if there is some self-help information here. So what we've done here is added the summary. Now I'm going to select the software. So I'll click on Adobe. Okay, and you'll see that we have another field pop up here. So this field wasn't here before, but now we need to select if it's temporary or permanent. So I'll go ahead and select permanent. And now we have a few more fields that pop up here. And again, this is kind of using that logic of let's keep the form really simple. Let's not make it overwhelming for the customer or the end user to submit these forms, and keep it as boilerplate and simple as possible. And there's a fine line of having too many fields and having the customer fill out too much information versus having not enough fields and having the customer submit a very simple and quick and easy request. So there's kind of a good middle ground there where we want to collect as much information as possible, but at the same time, we don't want to overwhelm the customer. So this is kind of a trick that I've put together with the conditional logic to help feel like the form is shorter while still pulling out as much information from the customer as possible. So quick statement of why you need access. Let's say for Adobe, I need to create Photoshop files. Just keeping it super simple here, but obviously maybe we'll want more information in this scenario. And depending on what's selected here from permanent to temporary, we'll have a different set of fields that show up. So if I select temporary, now we have another field that shows up that says, when should the access expire? So if I only need this for a week or maybe a couple of days, I could set the date here and maybe I'll just say next Friday. That should be plenty of time for me to get this done. And I'll outline, maybe I need a Photoshop file edited and I need to do a couple of things here. Don't need it for more than a week for XYZ purpose. Pretty simple, pretty easy to submit. These fields are already filled out. We have a couple more to go here. We'll select a manager, which I'll just put myself here in this case. And then any kind of attachments that we want to add here that might be related to this request. In this case, there's really nothing to add, so I'll just go ahead and submit this request. So again, throughout this whole process, what we're really trying to do is make it as seamless and possible for a customer to submit a request. We don't want to overwhelm them with too many options on the request portal. So if I go back to the service desk, we want to make it super easy to understand which group I should be going into, logins and accounts, which request I should be submitting. Again, keeping this very simple for the customer to understand and submit. And then once we're on the actual fields and filling out the form, we want to keep this as simple and easy as possible, only showing the fields that are necessary. If some fields are not necessary, we could remove them with conditional logic, and I'll go over how to do that in a little bit as well. But we don't want to overwhelm the customer from submitting a request, or if we do have a catch-all and we have a lot of fields here and I'm going through filling these out, the next time I do this, I might just go in here and say, maybe I'll just go to General IT Help, submit my request, add the summary, and send it in and be done with it. So the idea here is that we want it to make it feel easy. That way they feel comfortable. The end users feel comfortable submitting the request without necessarily going to the catch-all and just submitting a quick text request without any specific fields like adding in a manager or specific software that they need access to. So that's kind of the logic that we've been using at Grid.io to help IT teams to build out a portal. Jumping into the backend, I'll go over some of the things that we've done from the request type perspective. So if you're not familiar with how to set up these request types in portal groups, I'll go over that really quickly here. So inside of the project settings themselves, there are a couple of places where we're going to be essentially going into and adjusting these items. So as mentioned, there are request management items, which are pretty much anything related to the portal, as well as some backend items like workflows, etc. But if we're managing request types, there's a little drop down for that. And then there's a few different options here, and depending on the features that you have selected, some of these may or may not be here. In the Features tab, you can enable and disable some of these. Service requests are always going to be here, and this is essentially what we saw in the portal. So fixing an account problem, requesting a new laptop, general IT help, that was kind of our catch-all. And then we have incidents, and this is going to be all of our incident-related requests. And then this is where we could kind of put our IT hat and Jira administrator, agent hat back on, IT support person hat, and find out how is this going to be best suited for our team to understand what kind of a request is coming in. So after we've set up the portal in a way that's easy for the customer to understand and see things and submit things, we want to make it as easy as possible and as simple as possible with the most information possible for our agents to be able to execute and resolve those requests. So we're going to bundle those into request types to be able to understand whether or not it's an incident or a service request. An incident is typically going to be a higher priority item because something is either down or broken or there's a problem. So that means somebody usually can't work. There's certain automations we could run on incidents, issue types, versus service requests that can maybe give us higher SLAs, higher priorities, make it a little bit more urgent for the agent, versus a service request, which may be a little bit of a lower priority item. So one thing with these request types is that when I jump in, let's say I'm going to look at the request a new account, system access or software. This is what we just submitted. So in here, you see that we actually don't have any fields showing up in this request type. And that's because we're using a form instead of fields in this request type. So there's a couple of primary reasons we would use forms instead of just dragging in the fields. So if I wanted to maybe pull in the attachments here, the change reason, any other fields that I have, there's a couple of reasons that we want to do that in the forms, but the biggest one really is the conditional logic. So in here, if we go into the request type and we add these fields, there's really nothing we could do in terms of conditional logic to show or hide these fields depending on what is selected. So the idea is that we remove these, and instead of adding them to the request type, we add them to the form itself. So in the forms, there's a tab for forms here. We could go to that. We can create a new form, and I'll show you what the software access form looks like, which is what we built out here. So the software access form is going to have essentially all the fields that we want within our request type, but with some conditional logic. So you'll see here that what software do you need access to? There's going to be a section that starts here. And depending on what is selected, if Power BI is selected, we're going to have a conditional field that shows up that requests the customer for a little bit more information, whether or not it's a free or a paid account, or if you have certain tiers of accounts, you could add those in as well. We could also add a link or like a specific description on what those accounts exactly do if you wanted to provide more information to them. But the general idea here is that I didn't see this field when I was submitting an Adobe request. I also didn't see this field when I was submitting an Adobe request because this is specifically for Confluence. I only see this field after everything is submitted, which is one of the things that we implemented to only see certain fields once the first couple of fields is submitted. And again, the idea here is that we remove anything that isn't required or isn't necessary for a specific request type to be submitted, and making it a lot easier for the end user to submit a request. So if I'm building out a form from scratch, I'll go over a really quick example here. And let's say that I'll call this a laptop request form. All we need to do is go in here and add a field. And then here we can add a long text. We could call this the summary, since this might link to the summary field. And then once we have the summary, we could add a field for a drop down. And then in here we could have what kind of laptop do you want? And then once we have another question here, we could give it a couple of choices. Let's say we have a Mac option or a Windows option, and we have our employees request which laptop they want. We have those two options. And let's say that we have only some specific items for Mac. So Mac, we might be able to choose between a 14 and a 16-inch laptop. So the easiest way to do that is just to add a section. In this section, we're going to show conditionally. And in this conditional section, we're going to go ahead and type in which field, or select which field we want to show conditionally, and only show it if Mac is selected. So now this section will only show anything below here, will only show if we select Mac in the first option here. So I'll add another drop-down option, and I'll say what size, and there's going to be a 14-inch and a 16-inch. And then once I've added all the fields that I need to, I could add one field here or multiple. I will add another section to make sure that the rest of these show up all the time and not conditionally. So if I have a question that applies to everything here, let's say I'm going to have a paragraph field and say, why do you need this laptop? I want this question to show up regardless of whether Mac or Windows is selected. So if it's showing up under this Mac section, I'm only going to get it under the Mac option. And if it's showing up under this section, which is always showing, it's going to show up regardless of what option is selected. So it's as simple as that. And if I go to the preview here, this will give me a preview of what my form looks like and how it works. So if I type in a summary here, and then I choose which laptop I want, if I choose Windows, nothing happens since we don't have any other fields in the conditional logic for Windows. And if I choose Mac, we have that what size of Mac would you like, 14-inch or other. So that's how we set up those conditional fields. And obviously this could get really complex with multiple levels of conditional fields, which is what we often do with a lot of our request types. But that really helps to narrow down and get rid of all the fluff and all the fields that don't need to be submitted whenever a request type is being submitted from a customer. All right, so that's forms. Pretty simple to build out. Not too complex unless you're starting to get really into the weeds with a lot of those conditional logic. But otherwise, if you're doing some pretty light conditional logic, it should be pretty simple to set up and utilize within your Jira request types. Jumping back into the project here, I did want to cover how the issue types are structured. So the issue types, as I mentioned before, these are kind of the top level hierarchy. So you could think of these as like the parent items, and then the request types fall into the issue types. So we have like the change items, the incidents, the service request, a service request with approval. And then if I go to the service request types, these are going to be under the issue types. And you can see that in some cases we have, in most cases, we have a lot of these request types falling into a single issue type. So we could have 3 request types falling into a single issue type. There's a little bit more down here. So these are all going to be service request related items, sometimes a task. And then under incident, these are obviously all going to be incident issue types. And again, these are going to be, there typically are going to be multiple request types falling into an issue type. The reason we want to use these issue types and that they're good to set up and it's best practice to have an issue type broken out based on the type of requests that are being submitted is, again, we're kind of putting on our Jira admin and IT administrator hat here, And we want to be able to easily tell the difference between what type of request is submitted. So as I mentioned before, if it's an incident, it might be higher priority. So we might want to address those first. We might want to have a specific queue for those, maybe a specific SLA for incidents. And it's an easy way to decipher without having to go through and narrow down each request type. We just group them all into one issue type, and then we could report on, we could filter on, and utilize issue types a little bit easier. So one other thing that's really prominent with those issue types is the workflow of the issue type. So going into workflows here, you'll see that we actually have a unique workflow, which is, as I mentioned, a status, a group of statuses combined into one. If we have a workflow here, in some cases they're combined and we have one workflow for multiple issue types. In this case, every issue type has its own unique workflow. So I'll show you an example of maybe a simpler one here for task. So this is relatively simple. A task has a status of open, approved, declined, in progress, and done. And then we have a group of a few other issue types here in workflows. So if I go into service requests, it's going to be a little bit more complex. Typically, these are going to be a little bit different. So there's waiting for support, there's waiting for customer, depending on what stage of the request that particular issue is in. And then we have escalated, which is an option that a customer can also click on the portal itself. In progress, pending, canceled, resolved, and closed. And you might be seeing like some of these and questioning why they exist the way they do. This is really, sometimes it's preference, sometimes IT teams prefer to have resolved, canceled, and closed. Sometimes it's just resolved and closed, resolved and canceled. The reason we have closed is that, let's say an issue is resolved and sometimes someone comes back to us a day later and says, hey, it's actually not resolved. This issue came back today. Can you take a look at it again? The idea behind close is that we could run an automation, let's say 7 days later, that moves it from canceled or resolved to closed. And once a ticket is closed, it cannot be reopened. So if it's like 7 days or maybe 30 days, whatever you're implementing within your organization, once it's closed, it cannot be reopened. And the request is that the end user would go in and submit a new request in the portal, since it's already been a prolonged period of time and we can't reopen the same request after that certain period of time. And then another example here is request type with approval. So this is going to be a little bit different. Instead of going straight into waiting for support, we have a waiting for approval. And approvals are great for things like new equipment requests, maybe larger change requests, but something that needs approval before actually going into action. That's what we want to implement for things that maybe as an IT team you need an approval from an HR person or procurement or maybe a manager. This is a great way to implement an approval flow. That way, before it goes in progress, we have a waiting for approval, and then it could get canceled, or it could get unapproved, and then it could get approved. So if it does go into approved, it's basically the standard workflow that you would see for a request type. And if it gets unapproved, then it just goes straight to canceled. And you could reopen a new request for that approval if needed. But if it's canceled, that means it wasn't approved. And the workflow essentially doesn't happen, and the request itself gets closed out. So those are the primary differences between those two, and why we have two different issue types for approval and just a standard service request. So that's a quick overview of those request types, how they interact with those issue types and workflows, and how we utilize those form fields and a few other things to best cater and really help the customer submit requests easily. I do want to talk about queues as well and how those are best set up for IT teams. So there kind of is no wrong answer to queues, and that might be kind of sounding like a cop-out, but every team that I've worked with really has their own way of setting up queues and own way that they've thrived and worked efficiently with their queues. Here are a couple of ways that I've seen done very well that typically do have the best result for the IT teams themselves. So there's a few queues that should always be created in every single IT ticketing system, and that's obviously going to be the all open tickets. This is a really great way to see every single open ticket in your system. That way you don't have anything slip through the cracks. If you have something that's a little bit more narrowed down in some queues, maybe something's been lingering in here, having a setup here for all open queues is going to be a really great way to just see everything in one quick glance. All my open tickets is pretty much anything assigned to me. So if I jump in here and I go to that Adobe Access request and I assign this to myself, it'll show up in all my tickets now. So this is a great way to see anything I'm working on right now. And this is a queue that could be used by anyone else on the team. So if you have someone who's either assigning these tickets or they're assigning to themselves, or there's like a round robin automation running that assigns them, you could jump into this queue here. You'll have all of your tickets that are currently open and that you're working on in one place. VIP queue, this is great for working with either customers or maybe people in your organization, like executives who might need quicker support than just a standard person. Or if you're working with customers and you have certain tiers of plans or pricing that you're working with those customers. So if it's not an IT team, it might be a customer support team. If you have certain tiers of customers that you're working with, you could have a VIP queue for them here that could filter them in, and you know who to work with relatively quickly and who has a much more, who needs a quicker turnaround time. And again, this may or may not be useful for your team. I've seen it be useful for larger organizations where there's a lot of individuals who are in the executive team who may need quicker support or quicker turnaround times. Or you could just use this as a way to run automations and add a VIP label and be able to identify things that are maybe higher requests. So maybe it's not a VIP, but it's a more urgent issue. This queue could be renamed and the tag could be renamed, and it could be used as kind of an urgent queue rather than a VIP queue. So this is kind of the team priority queues. These are the ones that I would recommend for every team to have. VIP queue, again, could be changed to more of an urgent request queue. And then these kind of repeat here as well. And then there's a few more here that are pretty great for a lot of teams and a lot of larger enterprise organizations that have a lot of requests coming in. And that's going to be open incidents and open requests. And obviously the difference here is that one is just a request and it might be lower priority. An incident is a current outage or a current problem or a current system issue that someone may be having. So open incidents are a great way to just see that in one queue versus your open requests. And then open hardware issues, open software issues, that's a really easy way to see what type of request is being submitted. And we're obviously just filtering down by request type here. But the idea here is that if we have someone on the hardware team, maybe we have an IT tech who's primarily focused on hardware, they could have their own hardware queue, versus software. If we have someone who's primarily focused on the software side of things, they're going to have their own queue here as well. And then things like open onboardings. So we have one open for Michael Scott here, for example. This is a great way to see all of your employee transitions in one place and relatively easily. That way, if you have someone who's primarily in charge of creating accounts, removing accounts, we could do the same thing for offboarding here. This is one of those pretty common queues that I've seen a lot of teams use as well. Queues are pretty easy to build. So in the queue settings here, we have a list of queues that we currently have. We could also create a new queue. So maybe I want to create something for offboarding since I already have onboarding. I could select whether or not it's a team priority queue or not. Let's say it's not in this case, since it's not going to be super valuable to the entire team. I'll go ahead and make sure that the resolution is unresolved, which essentially is going to mean that the ticket itself isn't completed yet. So we want to make sure that's on for pretty much most of these queues, unless you want a queue that shows us anything that's resolved and unresolved. But anything you're working out of, you're going to want to say unresolved. Otherwise, you're going to see things in your queue that have been completed that don't need any more attention. So in here, there's a couple of ways to differentiate tickets. So there might be type, which is just issue type. So if I want to see incidents and service requests, that's how I set up those incident and service request queues. All I would do is click on that, and that automatically filters down those results. If I wanted to filter down by request type, and Jira's super flexible with these queues, so the great thing is we could pretty much filter down with any field that we have inside of a Jira ticket. So I'll click on this more field and I'll search for request type. And in here we should have a request type option. And now that shows up here. And let's say I want to only show the offboardings, so offboarding employees, and I'll name this queue offboarding. Maybe open offboarding just in case. So everybody knows it's open offboardings, not total or all offboardings. So I'll create this, and now we have a new queue for open offboardings. Very simple to set up, very easy to do. And again, these are very, very specific to teams and how teams like to work. But having a team priority queue where things are generally available at the top and easiest to see, especially all open tickets, is a really, really great way to make sure that nothing slips through the cracks. So jumping into SLAs as well, we have SLAs showing up in this view here directly. So if I collapse this item here, we should be able to see everything in one page. If I expand it a little bit more, there we go. So the great thing here is that we're actually sorting, we can sort by time to resolution as well. So things that might be expiring the soonest could show up at the top, which means we need to work on them the quickest. So that's one really, really cool thing about the SLAs. But we want to set up these SLAs and make sure that they're showing up as a column here inside of our queue. And that's pretty much as simple as editing a queue inside of the queue settings. And if I go to all open tickets, and here I have the ability to add or remove all of these columns here. So maybe I don't want to see the, let's say I don't want to see the created time. That might not be really necessary, or linked issues. So I'll have time to resolution, which is going to show up there, which is pretty critical. So I'll save that. And now I have my modified fields. And if you don't have your SLAs showing up within your columns, that's one thing I highly, highly recommend to have. Otherwise, you'll end up not seeing those SLAs unless you click on the issue itself. And that might be a little bit tough to gauge and see which tickets need to be highest priority. So to set up these SLAs, all we need to do is go to the project settings in the same place we were before. And inside of the request management, we have a tab for those SLAs. And there are two primary SLAs that pretty much every single team should have. I would say these two are like the gold standard, and there could be more, but these are the two that every single IT team should have at some point. And those two are going to be time to resolution, which is how long it takes for the ticket to get resolved, and time to first response, which is how long it takes for a first response to come in for that ticket. So these two are really important. First response is important because we don't want to keep an end user waiting too long before they receive a response on their request when it's submitted. And time to resolution, we want to make sure that it doesn't take weeks or months at a time to resolve a request. So if I wanted to edit or add any of these, all I have to do is add an SLA, and there's some out-of-box options available. These should be available within your project out-of-box as soon as you set it up. And I would really recommend editing these because they're usually not set up in the best way out-of-box. So all you need to do is open up the issue, edit, and in here you'll have a quick JQL to define what you're exactly essentially setting up the SLA for. So in this case, ticket category incident and service requests, those are going to be separate. So as I mentioned before, incidents may be higher priority than service requests, so they might need a quicker response. So in this case, we're defining certain priorities, and if we want to define a priority, in some cases there are no priorities defined, and we just have all issues targeting a time of a 2-hour response rate. But if you did want to separate these by priority, which I do highly recommend doing, we could add a priority here, select that, and if it's like a high priority or highest priority, we could select a target time for this particular priority. So something high priority might be 30 minutes, whereas maybe something medium priority, this might be 1 hour, and then everything else might be 2 hours. And then I would definitely define these for all of your priority levels. That way you have a good essentially a good target time for all of those, since some things might be low priority and might be a very minor bug that doesn't need to be resolved right away or doesn't need to be responded to right away. We could get to those a little bit later. So with the high priority and medium priority items that we just added, you can see that it's showing us a 24/7 calendar. So that is definitely something to keep in mind, which means that if this request gets submitted at 5 p.m. on a Friday, the counter is still going to keep going 24/7 until the Monday. So on Monday, we're going to be racked up at a lot of hours, and we're going to be looking at a way overdue SLA. So if your company operates only 9 to 5, I would definitely suggest using that, since you're not expecting to reply or resolve any of these issues within that time frame. Then I would definitely suggest 9 to 5. If your team is 24/7 around the clock, you could select 24/7. And then that way, if something does get submitted after hours, you're making sure that those SLAs are being tracked even after, during the weekend or after hours on a typical weekday. So I'll select 9 to 5 in this case, since this company may be just a 9 to 5 shop. And then I'll go through, add all the priorities here. Once I'm done here, I'll go ahead and check the conditions. These are typically set up pretty well as well. The only time I've really edited these are, sometimes when there's custom things that need to start the counter, or sometimes when there needs to be a paused countdown or paused timer. And this is very useful for if you're waiting for a customer, or if you're waiting for something pending, like a third party or a vendor or something along those lines. This comes in very handy with the time to resolution. So let's say that time to resolution, I'll go ahead and edit this one. Let's say that I want this to pause whenever I'm waiting for a customer to respond. So let's say I'm really quick. I respond right away as soon as the request is submitted. The customer takes 3 days to respond after that. And we don't want the SLA to be counting during that whole time. So what we do is inside of the pause countdown or counting time during, we set an option here. And these could be statuses. These could be, during an assigned action. Statuses are the most common one here, but let's say we want to pause the countdown when we're waiting for a customer. And we could set up some automations on the back end, just a little bit out of scope of this webinar, but we could set up automations that say anytime an agent responds, we move the ticket into waiting for customer. Anytime the customer responds, we move the ticket back into waiting for support. So once that automation triggers, we'll be able to have a status of waiting for customer, and in that status, we'll pause the SLA from counting. And the idea here is that if we have to wait long periods of time for the customer to respond, we'll be paused on that SLA for time to resolution, and it won't impact the agent and ding them negatively if they're being, on time and replying on time. So that's something some teams use. Some teams don't use that. Sometimes teams feel responsible for getting a reply from the actual end user themselves. So this really depends on how your team operates and how you expect your team to receive those replies, and maybe your just organization in general and how proactive they are and responsive they are. But that's a very common one that I've seen a lot of teams utilize in the past. So once those SLAs are all set up, we have those queues set up. We have all of the SLAs showing up on the right here, on the right side here. Right now, we just have the time to resolution. Time to first response might be a great one to add here in the columns as well. But when we click on a ticket, we'll have that SLA showing up on the top right as well, as long as it's added to the ticket, which looks like it may not be in this case. So if it's not, let's go to configure here on the bottom right, and we'll need to make sure that the SLA is added. Context field, it should be showing up. It might take a second to show up since I just made some changes. Usually it takes a few minutes to propagate, so that might show up in a few minutes here. But yeah, anytime you make SLA changes, it does take a little bit for those to apply to all the open tickets. So don't freak out if you're seeing things missing or if you don't see things applied right away. So that's a quick overview of those SLAs. Last thing and last bonus thing that we wanted to go over was the reports. So there's a few ways to report in Jira. There's obviously just the reporting here on the left side, which we'll go over in a second. But there's also dashboards which we could use for reporting. This is great for like a one place for multiple reports, maybe sharing with a manager or an executive for KPIs, things of that nature. But if I jump into the reports here, this is a great quick way to pull some reports from your Jira environment without putting in too much effort. The dashboards can take some time to set up, whereas these reports, some of them are great and available out of box, whereas we could also create a few reports here really quickly and easily. So there's a few options here that are default, like requests resolved. This will show us all the requests resolved, which we have done right now, but we have created versus resolved here, which is a custom report that's been created for us. And you can see here that on Wednesday, we had 12 created, 0 resolved. That's a really good one. SLA met versus breached. This will show you how many breached SLAs you have over a current time period or a specific time period. So in this case, we had 28 breaches today, which is a lot, but this is a great way to monitor which SLAs are met, where they're breached, and you could also drill into this data a little bit more just by clicking on it and seeing the request itself, who's the reporter, who's the assignee, kind of digging into each one of those individual tickets. And if you did want to create something new, all you have to do is hit the new report option here, and then you create a name for this report. I'll just say test report. And let's say I want to report on some of those SLAs that we've created recently. So click on the series here, which is kind of just their way of pulling in multiple reports into one. And I'll find a metric here. Let's say I want a metric on the average first response. So this is going to be based on the SLAs. I want to know how long it takes on average for my team to respond to a ticket within Jira. So I'll use that and I'll set this as green, label it as average time to first response. And once I have that ready, I could also filter out and only include specific issues here, or I could allow everything to be dropped in here. I'll click add, And now we have a series for how long it takes on average for a first response to come in. Not a lot of data in this project, so it's not showing us a lot of good information here. But if we wanted to layer another report on this, let's say average time to first response, and then in this report, I also want to see a series of time to resolution, which is the only other metric we can add on top of this one. I'll add that in as red, and average time to resolution. So I'm adding that average time to resolution and giving it a red color so that it's different from the green. And then we'll go ahead and add this report as well. And so now with these two series combined, you'll see that the both of those legends are showing up here, and we'll have those charts graphed differently, kind of like we do here with this SLA met versus breached. So we have those two lines, and those would typically interact and show us how many were met, how many were created, how many, how long on average it takes to respond to a request, how long it takes on average to resolve a request. So there's quite a bit of good options for reporting here right out of box from Jira. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of great stuff we could do with dashboards that is a lot more in depth, and we could report on pretty much any custom field and anything inside of Jira itself. I won't dive into that here because that's kind of a whole webinar in and of itself. But I did want to mention that that is out there, and if you did want to explore options there, there's some good dashboards out of box, as well as a lot of good third-party options that let you do a lot of really, really good reporting. Yeah, that was pretty much it. I know we kind of went over here a little bit, but we could dive into questions now. I'm sure there are a few out there. I saw the chat going as we were going through the webinar, so I'll go ahead and stop my share here. And we could dive into the questions. If you guys have any questions, feel free to drop those in the comments right now, and I will do my best to answer them. Looks like the difference between calendars was already answered, and I did kind of mention that earlier as well. But yeah, essentially 24 versus 9 to 5, we essentially have the option to set up a calendar for teams that work office hours or business hours versus teams that work 24/7. That's pretty much the easiest way to break it down. So how do you suggest working in a way that keeps things simple, but user field types that an agent can access to automate through flows? It seems that bots can't access the fields if you put them into forms. So yeah, that is one really good point. So when you're creating any kind of forms in Jira, it's really hard to reference those form fields within automations and within other smart values within Jira. So the trick with the forms is to utilize a smart or a Jira link custom field link. So essentially what I would do is go to the custom fields, create a custom field first, and then when I go to the form and I build out the form, I create the fields for the forms themselves, and then I link the form fields to the Jira custom fields. So that allows us to, when the form is submitted, fill out that custom field, run any automations we want on that custom field, use them as smart values, which is something we do pretty often and something I recommend with pretty much any forms that are created that any time in the future might be used for any kind of automations. All right. What is artificial intelligence scope in JSM? So there's actually a few things that JSM does in terms of artificial intelligence. There is their virtual bot that they've recently released. So there's a few things. From the portal perspective, for the customer, there are those suggestions that I showed when typing in a summary into the request or when typing into the search bar. This isn't really intelligence, I would say. It's more of just keywords and being able to pull in relevant articles. But the idea behind that is, let's say if a user types in VPN and they need to troubleshoot a VPN, instead of taking them straight to the form and submitting a request to an agent, we present them with a few different self-help articles. And ideally, when they could go in and see those articles, they can find their own solution, they could help themselves and not submit a request. So that's kind of step one, and we could even run a report on requests deferred within Jira. That's a really great thing to run, since we can actually see how many times a person went to the portal, found a self-help article, and did not submit a request. We could have like a percentage of deferred requests, which is a really, really great metric to know how good your documentation is. And then we obviously have like the virtual chatbots. That's a new implementation and a new feature from Atlassian. It's not super extensive yet, but it is getting a lot better. And their virtual chatbot is available, I believe, through Teams and Slack. And I believe they're bringing it to Portal soon as well, if I'm remembered correctly, I did see an announcement about that. But it is getting better and more widely adopted and used essentially every single day. I am seeing a lot of updates with the virtual bot and things that are coming out with those items. All right, so we have well over 60 request types. How do you manage switching to much simpler, a bunch of request types? This is for an organization with almost 500 people who are internal customers. So the first thing I would do right off the bat, if you have over 60 request types, that is a lot of request types. I would go through and run a report, see which request types are least used. So I'm sure there's some that you're getting in maybe a couple times a month that could probably be eliminated altogether almost right away. Once eliminating those, that's a really good place to start and maybe start consolidating certain items. So if there are certain requests that are very similar to each other, let's say maybe there's multiple requests for certain software and those are different request types. The way I would go about that is creating one conditional form and combining those into one, ideally, or maybe more than two into one. Maybe it's 3 or 4 request types into one, and then having it feel the same, but also easy to submit and very easy to go through and not have too many fields on that with conditional logic inside of those forms. So yeah, number one, I would just go through, run a report, see what you could get rid of. Number two, see what you can merge together using those conditional fields in forms. All right, let's see. So there's an example question here of where 3 approvals are needed from 3 different groups at one status, and we have multiple people from each group as approvers. Is there a way to make sure that each approver and approving for a different group/team inside of JSM? So there are a couple ways to address this. If you wanted that done in one status, there is an option to have an approval for a group or multiple groups. And there's an option in Jira that you could check that says all groups or all users have to approve in order for the actual request to continue going. If you don't check that box, it's only one user or one group that needs to approve for the request to move forward. But if you do check it, then you could have multiple approvers within that request that need to approve prior to moving forward. The second way is just to have different approval layers. So you could have group 1 approve in one status, group 2 approve in the second status, group 3 approve in another status. That's pretty common for like change advisory boards. I've done that quite a bit with if you're making a change, there is a CAB approval first or a manager approval first that goes into a CAB approval after that. So there's a couple of options you have there. All right, what else do we have here? What's the difference between portal groups and request type group? So essentially, portal group, well, their portal group is essentially just a request type group. So on the very front end of the IT portal, we had those groups. Those groups are encompassing a certain number of request types. So if we have 5 request types that we want to group into one specific area or one specific portal group, that's essentially what the portal group is. IT team is splitting into multiple groups, security, compliance, etc. Would you suggest a single service desk or more? That is actually a really, really great question. And it really depends. So usually an IT team, I'd suggest sticking to one portal, one project, with the exception of if work is so siloed that there is essentially no need for collaboration. If your security team will never need anything from the IT team, if you're not collaborating on tickets together, if your request types are going to be entirely different, that's a good indicator that maybe they need their own request or portal group. But at the same time, if you put on that customer hat and you want to make sure that there's not too many portals for the customer. So if it's an IT request, you want to make sure that they know that when they click on IT in the portal for IT, that their security request is going to be in that portal versus diving through multiple portals for support, infrastructure, product support. So unless your customers are very well educated and know exactly where they'll need to go, and unless your teams are extremely siloed and won't need any kind of collaboration or any kind of shared request types within the same project, that's when I'd start to consider breaking that into individual portals. Is it possible to send request agents based on their workload? So I'm guessing you're asking if we can assign based on workload, which the answer to that is yes, we can. So essentially there's an automation that could do round robin or based on workload, but we could assign requests to individuals based on their workload. I'll do a couple more here since we're a little bit over, but trying to answer as many of these as I can. I have one ticket where one stage is one team and another stage is a second team. Same thing with third team. How can we make sure that they can access uh, uh, the access? I'm guessing you're saying the tickets that are related to each other. So if you have multiple teams, whether they're cross project or in the same project, we can link those issues together. And when we link those issues together, if you're looking at one issue, you can see all the linked issues related to that one issue inside of that ticket that you're looking at. So issue linking is the way that we achieve that within Jira Service Management. Yeah, all right. I guess that's kind of all the questions. I know that we're a little bit over here, but I just wanted to say thank you for everyone who is joining. I want to share really quickly some exclusive items that I know we promised at the end of this. So if you ever wanted to reach out again, feel free to scan the QR code, contact us, reach us at grid.io. Feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to help and help answer questions. And then the bonus piece of content is that we also have a free 15-minute consultation for anyone who is interested. After this call, we're sending out a follow-up email. That'll include a link to book a call with myself for a 15-minute consultation to help answer any questions, to help clear up any quick blockers. So if you're interested in that whatsoever, we will be sending that out via email right after this call. But otherwise, thank you everyone so much for joining. It's been great having you on. And again, feel free to reach out at any time. Thanks, everyone.